welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming along to the sold out session. When the session was suggested by Sophie, I have to say that I was a cynic and thought no one will come, and no one wants to come along and hear journalists, let alone pay for them, even when there's a free glass of bubbly thrown in. So it's really, really gratifying to see so many people coming at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning to this session. Thank you so much. Thanks so much to the Book Fest again for this amazing event that runs all weekend, and to Spy Valley for hosting us here. It's an amazing venue that we've used every year, and we love coming back here. So, look, my name's Mike White. I'm a writer with North and South magazine. I began my journalism career here in Marlborough 20 years ago at the Marlborough Express, and it's lovely to be able to come back. And this morning we've got three of New Zealand's top long-form journalists, feature writer journalists, people that write longer stories, and we're really lucky to have them. We've got Charles Anderson, Naomi, Arnold, and Nikki Macdonald. Charles and Naomi come from Nelson. Naomi's an award-winning freelance journalist who writes for New Zealand Geographic, Wilderness, Fairfax, a spin-off. She's the author of World of Wearable Art, 30 Designers Tell Their Stories. She's had essays in 2 collections of Tell You What, Great New Zealand non-fiction. She's the founder of a website called Featured, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, which collects great New Zealand long stories, the best of New Zealand storytelling, essentially. She does book reviews to Radio New Zealand. You might have heard her at about 20 to 11 on Catherine Ryan's show, 9 to noon in the morning. And she's also the coordinator of the Nelson Book Fest, which is coming up in October this year, and I'd encourage anyone that's inspired by this event to have a look at what's over the hill in October. It's got a great lineup as well. Charles Anderson's works appeared in the International New York Times, The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, National Geographic Traveller. He's worked in Africa, Indonesia, East Timor, Thailand and India, covering everything from food crises to peacekeeping to sex trafficking and kickboxing. And he's more recently worked in Nelson for the Nelson Mail. He won the 2014 Canon Media Award for Innovation in Multimedia Storytelling. He was the Canon Newspaper Feature Writer of the year after. He's also been New Zealand's Travel Writer of the Year. Nikki Macdonald on the far side is a senior feature writer with the Dominion Post in Wellington. She also began her journalism career here in Marlborough at the Marlborough Express. She was recently named the Canon Media Awards Feature Writer of the Year for the short form section. She's been the Fairfax Feature Writer of the Year 3 times. She's worked overseas, covering things like the Pakistan earthquake, the tsunami in Samoa, the Nepal earthquake's aftermath, and more recently here in New Zealand she's covered the quakes in Christchurch and Kaikoura. And for the love of journalism, she's eaten hospital food for a week, puffed her way through a police fitness test and reported from the inside of a nuclear reactor, the things we do as journalists. Look, it's often said that it's tough times in journalism, and I don't think anyone's shying away from that. And I guess the recent news about the reduction in publishing days at the Marlborough Express, the local paper here, and the Nelson Mail over in Nelson is a sign of that things aren't brilliant. And I have to say personally, it's really, really sad for someone that worked a long time on the Marlborough Express and loved it, that it's down to 3 days a week. But those are the kind of challenges, I guess, that are in front of faced by media organisations nowadays. So it's really easy to get really gloomy about the state of journalism and the future of journalism. So what we're here to do today is try and tell you that it's not all horrible and that there is bright spots within it. And so I guess I just wanted to get an idea from the panellists here today how they see the state of journalism, but particularly long-form journalism, feature writing, because in an age of clickbait and everyone's supposedly got shortening attention spans and only able to read 140 characters at a time, it would be nice to know that there's still scope for a longer story, a well-written long feature. And so I guess I'd like to know from any of you guys, is there still an appetite out there for longer stories, for feature stories, and is there still an ability for people to write them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that more than ever there is. Newspapers they're a tangible product which has a certain amount of space involved in it, and therefore writers are told, here's your word count, and you have to stick to that. And even if they want to get florid with their language and beautiful and eloquent, an editor will come in and slash it back to whatever will fit that space. But now there is none of that restriction. And so what I've found working in newspapers as I've kind of tried to evolve into this digital world is that, writers like to write, journalists like to write, and often a story is worth more than 500 words that you get given by an editor. So they'll write longer for online space, and they'll have to get cut back. So it's almost like the websites have given a bit of breath to journalists who want to do more. And in terms of the appetite for it, often those stories are the ones that people will engage with the most. It's kind of become more of a norm to see a longer story than a shorter story online, I think, because people spend time with it, and those are the ones that get shared around. People have a little bit of time to delve in and share it with their friends, and it's a bit more meat on it rather than a little short article that can kind of be digested and thrown away and on to the next one.
Naomi, are you depressed by the state of journalism? Or
I have a really short attention span, so I can't blame anyone for having one. But I actually think that we've gone through the clickbait period and we're coming to a anti-clickbait period now. I mean, we know that, when websites first began, we know what people clicked on. It's all the sex, drugs, rock and roll, and in Nelson it's cafe reviews and new coffee and cafe things that pop up. That's like the number one. But I think we've seen the destruction of the media landscape online, and we are coming back towards wanting to save it now. So you've got, there's a new science journalism fund that's just about to close, actually, promoting really good science stories. You've got the spin-off, which has just announced $1 a word, which is an incredible rate for long-form investigative stories. It seems like there's more of an energy and excitement about producing really good stuff, because we've seen, we've been through this sort of 5 to 10 years of Kim Kardashian sort of type clickbait, and that's what we all click on because that's the highest in the rankings. But I think even private organisations and interested parties interested in the health of journalism have been interested in a revival of quality stuff.
And is that because you think that the public is demanding that, or do you think they think, oh gosh, there's a bit of an obligation to look like we're a vaguely responsible media organisation?
I don't think the public. It's interesting that the public's depends on journalism, depends on their politics. It depends on a lot of different, personal aspects. If Nikki Hager comes out with an incredible book, half the people in New Zealand will say, oh, he's lying, or he's what was that? What did John Key call him? A left-wing conspiracy theorist,
yeah.
I think. Yeah, so even if you do, Nikki Hager does the best journalism in the country. He lives on the smell of an oily rag, producing incredibly quality stuff, and half of people in New Zealand, or a significant percentage, are just going to write it off as nothing. So it depends on the audience, what they think is true, what they want. I think the state obviously still has a really important part to play in keeping the government accountable. Yeah.
Nikki, you work for the Dominion Post, and in the time that you've been there, you've seen the numbers of feature writers shrink quite a bit, to the point where you are perhaps the only full-time feature writer who's able to do investigative stuff rather than than cafe reviews and things like that. So, can you explain what the environment is there at Fairfax, which is one of the main media companies in New Zealand that owns the Marlborough Express and the Nelson Mail and the Press? Can you explain how much support and encouragement there is for feature writing for longer form stories?
Yeah, look, undoubtedly we have seen a massive decline in the bare number of people doing it. But thus far, the few of us left do get pretty good support. Basically I'm in the extraordinarily privileged position of really being given the time and autonomy to do pretty much what I want, and it really comes down to, they'll almost ask me what I'm doing and when I'm going to deliver it, which is pretty amazing in this day and age. So for those of us left at this point, there is still pretty good support. And actually, I mean, it does. We do hear so much about kind of clickbait and short attention spans, but actually, in the space in which we can measure it, which is obviously online in the digital space, long form stories still do well, as long as they get the promotion and the support. So, I mean, so much comes down to how they're not so much treated online, but obviously, if you get any prominence, if you get space on Stuff's homepage, then obviously that's a window and people are going to see the story, and then you can start to get some engagement. But if it's buried kind of at the back in the back of the hierarchy somewhere, then that becomes a lot more difficult. So a lot depends, I guess, on the support that you get from those kind of Stuff homepage editors. And
what about the resources? I mean, just the physical resources to say take 2-3 weeks to destroy, maybe travel. Are they still there? Because often, to write a long story, a feature story, it's not something you can just turn around in a day or two. It's not something you can just do over the phone. So are those kind of resources still there, do you find?
Well, travel's certainly been restricted, especially in the past few years, but having said that, there is still money if you come up with something that really has promise, and you can really demonstrate that it's going to deliver a great story or something of importance. So if you can sell a good idea, there is still flexibility there. And as I say, for most reporters, no, there is not that time. But so again, it's a privilege that is that a few of us get, and I'm very aware of that.
But for this kind of work, I think people gravitate towards it. If you're in the industry, you sort of, it requires an effort and a sort of a bit of dedication that you don't come by in your day-to-day work. So for me, for example, I've technically never been a feature writer employed as such. I've always worked on stuff, picking away at things over long periods of time, sort of passion projects, I guess. And especially when you were younger, you could justify that because you were trying to sort of figure the world out that you've landed in. So people are going to gravitate towards that. And in terms of the support and things, I mean, I've noticed, for example, Fairfax seem to be putting a lot more effort into showcasing longer stories, like in terms of design and that kind of thing, which is another important part of this. Is that there's a reason why people pick up magazines, is because they look wonderful and they're beautifully designed and they're laid out. But so often, especially only a couple of years ago, it was so horrible to read something long online as opposed to in a book, because it was just a screed of text, and there was no kind of anything to break up your attention span and things to look at. But now there actually is options to make things look nice online, which I think makes a big difference to people wanting to spend time on things.
And it's amazing what people will read. I mean, I wrote a 4,000 word story, which is quite long for a print story, earlier this year, based on a prison interview with a kind of charming con man. And 2 people came to me the next day and said, "Oh my goodness, I read that whole thing on my phone."
That is,
and I'm thinking, well, rather you than me, but wow, like that's pretty cool. So I always kind of think, well, people still read books, so people still have the attention span for a really good yarn. So it's just that they're not going to read it because you've stuck it in front of them on a page of a paper and it's just there. So you've got to sell it, I suppose.
The design of the story on the mobile phone is so incredibly important to getting people just to keep scrolling. It just has to be text. Yeah. The best compliment is I read it all the way to the end.
Yeah.
That's all. That's the best.
Yeah. Just so that we don't lapse into any kind of journo speak, when we talk about the number of words, that's how we kind of, amongst ourselves, we gauge how long a story is. Just for reference, a story that you read in a newspaper might, an average news story might be 300 words, maybe 500 words if you're really lucky. The kind of stuff that we're talking about here, and we talk about this word long format, and I know Naomi really doesn't like this word, but it's just what's talked about. It's feature writing. It's a long story, essentially. And that's kind of anything from maybe 1,000 words on. An average story in North and South that I work for, 4,000 or 5,000 words. The longest thing that I've bored people to death with was about 13,000 words, halfway to a book. So that's the kind of range that we're talking about in these stories. So for someone to read 4,000 words on an iPhone is pretty good. Hey, Charles, you mentioned something there, that stuff that you'd done before. You used the word passion projects. And it's something that I kind of always think is important, that you have to be, to do justice to these stories, to a long story, you have to be really into them. And the first editor I had at North and South, a woman called Robin Langwell, man, she was scary, big, red hair and fiery. And she always said to me, you've got to be into your stories, you've got to really be passionate about what you're doing, otherwise you'll do a rubbish job. And she'd sometimes ring me up and say, oh, what about doing this around this? I'm like, oh, yeah, it could be interesting. And she said, no, you're not into it, obviously. You're not going to do it. You're not going to do a good job. That's great. So that means, essentially, that in all the time I've been in North and South, I've been able to choose the stories that I do. Wow, what a luxury. So I just wonder from you guys, how important is that, is being able to choose your own stories, and are the stories that you are most passionate about the ones that end up being the best stories in the end?
Yes. I sort of think over like the last 5 or 6 years of my work, and yeah, they're the ones that have been on the boiler for a long time that you've thought about, and then eventually you've got the time that you've chipped away at and pulled it together. And yeah, you have to believe in the story long enough to get to the end of it. You don't want to get really excited about an idea and then actually figure out halfway through, now I've got to actually bloody finish this thing. And it shows, that kind of thing actually shows in the writing and the telling of it, because if you are trying to engage a reader to read through even 1,000 words these days to 7,000, 8,000 words is probably my longest one, you have to sell it and you have to trust in it. If you can't believe in it, then how do you expect a reader to kind of get through the end of it? It's kind of selling not only yourself short, but also the reader short. So it has to be something that you're totally into, for sure. Mm.
Nikki, you get the chance pretty much to choose your own stories? That's where your stories come from?
I mean, occasionally I'll get asked to do stuff, and obviously even in the past, a lot more you'd be asked to do something on a particular subject, and of course you do it, and of course you still try and do a good job of it. And sometimes you'll surprise yourself, a story or an issue that you're not desperately into to start with, then you kind of start getting into the research and find that you do really get interested in it. But yeah, I think definitely, as Charles says, journalists do have famously short attention spans, so sometimes you do get halfway through a story and think, oh, why did I do this again? So it's good if it was your idea, because then there's no one to blame, and so there's no excuses.
But,
yeah.
I remember I worked with Naomi for quite a few years, and to her own detriment, she tried to put equal amount of effort into every story that she was given across her desk. So she'd spend, hours and hours on, a beautiful, great idea of like a story with gravitas and human emotion and drama, as she would for, a story about a cafe owner who's just,
Cafes are really important to the Nelson.
But my argument was that you can't put yourself into every story, because you will just burn out.
Leave.
Exactly. So yeah, there's a time, emotion management when it comes to these things, that you have to be able to just to shuffle things on, and you have to be able to invest yourself in the right project.
Yeah. Naomi, you're freelancing, so you're sort of able to choose what you do and what you pitch to editors, or is it the other way around? Editors saying, I want this, I want 1,000 words on this.
I've just ticked over my 3rd year freelancing anniversary, full-time. Thank you. When I first started, I was pitching to everybody, just, hire me, how about this? And now it's actually, editors are now commissioning me to do stories they want, which is good and bad, because I've managed to build relationships with Wilderness and Geographic, New Zealand Geographic, which are publications that I really enjoy writing about the outdoors and the environment. So often what they'll say, can you write this? I'll say, yes, that would be great. But they still don't. The pay rate is still difficult to justify with the hours. So I had this really tricky calculation when I first started about how many hours I would have to spend to earn the New Zealand median wage. I think it was like 50,000 or something. And it was probably like 3 days per 1,000 or 2,000 word story, which is a decent feature story to pay for Kiwis, to pay for KiwiSaver and medical and my phone and internet and heat and things. So it is not. They don't pay enough. They don't.
So how do you manage that? Do you set
Um,
parameters and say, okay, well, this is what I got? Because I had a friend who freelanced and she was absolutely just militant about that. Well,
Yeah,
this is what
yeah.
I want to be paid for this story, so this is the amount of time
Yeah.
that I'm going to spend on it. And
Yeah, well, 50 cents
That's
a
it.
word has been the same rate since 1990,
Yeah.
I think, possibly earlier. The job has got easier with the internet, but it's not enough, yeah. So you just write as quick as possible, and luckily after 5 years of journalism, daily news journalism, I can write as quick as possible and just
Get it down.
and get it good enough. And so as a freelancer, I do have passion projects that I work on for New Zealand Geographic. I will spend an inordinate amount of time on a 15,000 word story. I think it's on that bit of paper that was took so much time. It was 2 tramping trips and a lot of interviews and a lot of research. And I didn't even calculate the rate per hour for that. But for everything else I do, I just don't even want to know.
Yeah.
Because it was more important than the money.
Pretty depressing, yeah.
But for the rest, because my entire income is freelancing, I've got 14 stories on at the moment. So everything it's not, I think there's some phrase I used to repeat to myself all the time. Done is better than good, I think.
Right.
So I have a few during the year that I'm really, really into, and the rest of them is just get it done, get it good.
Yep.
And then, yeah.
Hey, you mentioned that the sheet that we put on everyone's seats, this was just it's an idea that we thought people hear us jabbering on about good storytelling, good stories. We each chose 3 stories that, if you want to go home and Google them, they are fantastic stories in our view. And maybe, can I get each of you just to pick one of the stories that you've chosen and say why you think this works, what makes it a great feature? Because, I mean, of course it's subjective, books are subjective, any writing's subjective, but I think most of us would agree that all these stories really stack up. Charles, do you want me to remind you what you're doing? You can go last, Charles. So just give people an idea why those stories that you chose, why they affected you, why they've stuck with you, and what worked about them. Nick, you can start.
yeah, well, mine are really quite different, and I undenied as to what to choose. So the New Zealand one that I chose was, it's almost an essay, I suppose, by Vicky Anderson, who's a Christchurch press reporter. And it was written literally, I think, the night of the February 22nd earthquake. And it's an extraordinary piece, not because it's some great investigation or because it's taken her 3 weeks or it's this incredible get, but it's just an amazing piece of writing. And I think that's because it was so raw and so visceral and just absolutely in the moment. And I think it was the single piece of writing that came out of that, of the quake, that really just summed up just how incredibly, just the incredible impact that had on the city and on the people who were involved. So I think it was really just a beautiful piece of writing, but an incredibly kind of honest and powerful piece of writing that really brought home the impact of that event. And the other one that I chose was, The Falling Man, which was interesting for lots of reasons. Interesting as a starting point for a story. So the genesis or the germ that came from was just a single photo from the Twin Towers. And you can see it's an incredibly powerful photo of a man who's jumped. And it's a beautiful piece of writing, but it's also interesting in that it's a fascinating investigation into trying to find out who this person was and what their kind of life story was. But often, I guess, with investigative stories, the journalists will do the investigation, and then kind of present their conclusions or, present what they've found out, whereas this is interesting in the light of, I guess, I don't know if the development of podcasts, and it's a similar kind of narrative storytelling in a sense to what we're starting to see there, and that's that the writer actually takes you on that journey with them. So you kind of become involved in that investigation, and you see some of the process, and you actually kind of see the dead ends that they go down, and then begin again. So it's interesting from the way that it's told, and just a slightly different approach to storytelling.
And that's Fallen Man, I think, is the most popular. It was published in Esquire.
Yeah.
It's the most popular, or the most read story ever in the history of
magazine.
Esquire. And just one other point about the Vicky Anderson piece, which I really encourage people to read. She wrote that on the night of the earthquake, and she wrote it on a phone because there was no power. So you just imagine that, trying to write a long-form piece on your phone. It's really amazing.
And just another thing on that, she's, I guess, just to show that the emotion that's gone into it, she's never been able to read it since.
Naomi.
Yeah, I think Vicky won a Canon for that, I think.
Yes, I
Canon
think she
Award,
did. Yeah.
I chose my New Zealand one was Amy Cronin, who's a friend, and I really adore her writing. She puts so much effort into it. She cares so much, just to the point of driving herself crazy. So that one was for the listener, and it was about those vans, what do you call them? Buses?
Truck shops.
Truck shops, yeah, that go around usually low-income neighbourhoods and prey on low-income people. I mean, that's arguable, but it seemed, from her story, it was quite obvious that people will walk in not really having much understanding of the terms they're entering into and then getting stung, $400.
It's like hire purchase kind of things.
Yeah, but it's outside your house, and if there's beautiful luxury goods in there that you can't have otherwise, it's very tempting, and of course, why shouldn't they have beautiful luxury goods? But anyway, she just did a really good job of, it wasn't something, I'd seen them, but it wasn't something I was aware of as, being quite devious in the way they infiltrated neighbourhoods, and she just had the best ending line, I think it was, that was just a really clear ringing bell of a final line, which is so important.
Don't tell them.
I'm not going to. And a good story, you have to go and read it. But I love Amy's work, and I really liked that one. And I think she was a finalist in the Canon Awards with that one in her portfolio. So, and the second one I chose was, I think it was a Pulitzer Prize winning story, the really big one, and that was just I love science writing and science journalism, and that was just a fantastic human interest way to get into this enormous earthquake that's due to strike the west coast of the United States, and it will cause incredible destruction that nobody's ready for. And it was in the New Yorker, and it had such a massive impact. No one had they didn't really know about it. They didn't know that these waves would be crashing, entire days driving inland and wiping out 300 schools. And
the entire Pacific Northwest.
It's going to be underwater and breaking off and sailing out into the ocean. But it was just a fantastic example of getting really important science that wasn't widely known and communicating it to the general public, and it had a huge impact. And she's a brilliant writer. Yeah.
I remember that piece that basically the first sort of quarter or half of it is just placing you in this apocalyptic scenario where, okay, if this happens, this is what will happen.
Yeah.
And it just very kind of matter of fact. Schools will be shut down, but a huge amount of reporting goes into these kind of details, but basically went through the entire kind of, government scenario of what would happen if a huge natural disaster hit that amount of people at one time. And it was just, most people, commented on that saying it was absolutely terrifying, but what made it terrifying was this kind of just almost deadpan kind of way of telling it, rather than like over-dramatising and shoving it down people's throats.
Yeah, it's the best way to tell stories that are already incredibly dramatic. It's just as simply as possible.
Let the story tell itself.
Yeah.
My story was one when I was just learning the craft. I kind of just read a lot of stuff and tried to figure out how to do some of the great stuff that I enjoyed reading. This piece was in Outside magazine, which is kind of, sort of an outdoors magazine in the States, which has fostered really good feature writing, the movie The Perfect Storm, if you remember that from back. So that was originally an Outside magazine article that was turned into a book. So that kind of adventure, action kind of stories, adventure journalism, that kind of idea. This one was about a guy who was trying to dive to the deepest hole, I think, in the world. It was in South Africa, and basically no one had done it, and this guy's friend had gone down there and had died, and on trying to get back up, and he became obsessed with trying to get back down that hole to retrieve his friend. And so the writer kind of just takes you there in this whole sort of, it's sort of tragic idea of this guy trying to retrieve his lost friend. But what I loved about it was that it hides all the reporting. What I think with great feature writing is that you shouldn't feel like you're being told information that you think someone's found out. It sort of just washes over you. In the same way that a great novel is just, you just accept it, and you absorb the story rather than the facts and the information in it. And that's what I became quite obsessed with myself, is that how do you make a story feel like you're just imbibing it, without having to make any effort. And it was really all about how well you can report. And I think that's something that is often underappreciated with feature writing, is that, and I'm sure you guys have come across this term colour writing, which is kind of this idea that, okay, you guys can write some nice words. Can you go off and experience something and write something, a few hundred words about something really, like a few nice words. But what it kind of is dismissive of is actually to write nice words, you have to get nice material to write the words off. You don't make stuff up. We have to go in and get details and information. And in my experience, the best feature writers are the best reporters. And often that's why, people like yourself, people like Nikki and Naomi have gravitated towards this kind of work, is because, if you do great reporting, there's only so much space to showcase it. So inevitably, you want to have more space and more opportunity to kind of showcase the stuff that you've found out. So this is kind of like novelistic, is kind of the style that I'd describe, and it's kind of goes back to the American kind of style of long form feature writing, which is, how do you write a non-fiction true story, a non-fiction novel, I think is what Truman Capote called it. But that kind of idea, using tools in the novel writer's tool belt to create a real story that is true to what happened to the best of your ability. And that this example is kind of great because it has all that, has human drama and tragedy and all that great stuff that you kind of latch onto as a storyteller. But it's just beautifully done. The other one is quite different. It's a story by Becca Levin, who was a Christchurch Press feature writer again. They're actually one of the only, one of the sort of few outlets in the country that maintains about 3 feature writers, I think, 3 or 4, which is pretty good, and probably the biggest feature section in the country next to the Herald. And it's about this a nobody really, a old guy who was I think probably the story came out of probably a brief on page 3, which was a house fire in sort of suburban Christchurch and sort of one of the darker, more run-down neighbourhoods. A man was inside and was found dead in the morning, kind of thing. So Beck did the great thing, which was ask a question, which is, who was this person? Who was this nobody that no one seemed to care about? And basically traced him back to his childhood and sort of followed his entire story. And it turned, he was an alcoholic, kind of run down, I think, was mentally handicapped, and sort of traced his story about how does one become this person that ends up on page 3 of the Christchurch Press after dying in a fire that no one cares about, which I think in the end is one of these great ideas of like how humans, who are we? Who are these people? Everyone wants to know about different people in the world, especially ones who are different from us. But what she was so brilliant able to do was kind of create that link between someone who's reading it in the paper and someone who is so different, but creates that human link that that sort of implores you to keep reading and learn about someone from a different background. But she has this great way with language back, and it's sort of the way she talks as well. I think even in the first line or two, like it's something like he was pickled in his own juices or something, because he was basically an alcoholic and was on meths and all kinds of horrible stuff. But this kind of it feels almost mean when I say it like that. But the way she just this is what it is. This is how he died, and we shouldn't sort of shy away from it.
Beck has a really deep sense of empathy, and that comes across in all her work. She's very connected to people, and
Look, a lot of the stories on that list. And I'm guilty of it. The international story. We each chose an international, a New Zealand, and then one of our own stories. But the story that I chose, the international story, was about a soldier killed in Iraq, and for me it was one of those stories. I just finished it, and I was, I come from Marlborough, I don't cry much, but I was on the verge of tears. It was that powerful, but I was just blown away by the storytelling technique. And it's not he he starts at the very end when the soldier is buried, and he's talked to everybody, the grave digger, the soldiers that fold the flag to put on the coffin. But he works his way back. It's totally the opposite to what you'd think. You'd start with this poor Marine getting killed in Iraq, and then, trace the journey through. Does it exactly the opposite way, but it somehow works, and it is one of the most powerful pieces I've ever read. The second one is a story about a boxer, a journeyman boxer, a guy that gets pummeled usually, but ended up fighting Sonny Bill Williams. And that's by a guy called Peter Malcaron, who unfortunately, because journalism doesn't pay, has had to sell his soul and now was working for a bank, because he couldn't make ends meet. Sorry, I hope not too many people work for banks here.
Peter
banks are really great. Banks are really important. I use banks myself. But
he's still writing though.
Yeah, occasionally. He's now working for a city council up in Napier, but because he couldn't make ends meet as a freelance writer, which is a real shame because he's a brilliant writer. And this is a fantastic story that took him years to do, partly because Peter is hopeless at meeting deadlines and just drifts and drifts.
Mike doesn't like Peter,
but it just traces this guy's journey from, I could have been a contender kind of guy, through to someone just doing chump change fights and then ending up fighting Sonny Bill Williams. Beautiful story, beautiful writing. But look, the thing that comes across, can I exhort you not to binge on this list, because there is a lot of death and a lot of depressing stories kind of here. Just snack on them, okay? But this is something that comes up. A lot of the greatest storytelling, a lot of the greatest feature stories involve really tragic stories, and they can be pretty grim. Charles, are we just drawn to this? Are we ghoulish, journalists, or is it just the nature of human drama that often makes the best stories?
I don't know. I think you look at what you read generally, what you watch generally. Inevitably, it's about life and death, and what else is there, right? And that is where drama and humanity lives, is in those extreme moments in people's lives. We have the luxury and the privilege of being able to go in and immerse ourselves in these most poignant and difficult and tragic parts in people's lives, and it's hard not to get swept up in that. This is part of the kind of strange and curious thing about journalists, is that often we take it for granted that we just go in and we can ask people questions that no one in their right mind would ask without thinking they're going to get slapped in the face. But we have this kind of calling card that we're able to go in and do this sort of work. So it's almost communicating that part of humanity to a wider audience, and I think humanity kind of exists in those extreme moments of people's lives, and inevitably it's going to involve death. I mean, but conversely, some of my favourite stories are also funny ones about life, and unfortunately there's not that many on that list.
You just didn't choose them.
I didn't choose them because but they're out there, so I just think it's where the drama is, and that's where stories are.
Yep. Naomi, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I was just thinking, as Charles was talking about, how Tracy Neal, who was a reporter at the Nelson Mail, now Radio New Zealand reporter, said to me once, I sat opposite her for 5 years, so we just absorb each other's emotions and stress and things, and she was tapping away on deadline and just said, no one owes us anything. Just, they don't need to talk to us in relation to something. And I was like, oh, that's absolutely true. Like, nobody wants to be the subject of a piece like that. Imagine, Beck's subject, knowing he was a figure of, being turned into a character. These are real people. It's really hard to actually pick out, to delineate a person in a piece of work. And I was just sitting there thinking that even with non-fiction novel writing, you're still creating a story. You're still editorialising. You're pulling out bits that you think are newsworthy or create the narrative, and it's still a fiction, a layer of fiction on top of what's actually going on. And I've completely forgotten your original question.
It's fine.
What was it? It
was, grim.
Why was it grim death? That's right. They're the most important things that happen to us in our life, and they draw out the biggest emotions. And love is also, a massive important thing. We don't actually read that much about love
Well,
stories.
Don't
I mean,
Beck
great
wrote-
songs
true.
and
Beck wrote a wonderful story about a guy who she used to get these very strange letter writers to her. She had
Yeah,
a column
she's-
in the
yeah.
press, and that one of her letter writers sent her like a quilt with her name written on it. It just had a great
Yeah.
fan base. But one of them was a guy who was talking about all the. He wrote a column about the bed that she
Or the
slept
life
in.
in bed.
Yeah,
Beds,
and he wrote a really long story. I wrote a
That's
letter to
lovely.
us talking about all the beds that he'd slept in
Yeah, yeah.
in his life.
42 of them
and
or
how
something.
That's a
that
great
was-
story.
That
Yeah.
became, I guess, the vehicle for telling this guy's life story. It wasn't
Yeah.
about the houses he lived in or the people he loved. Or
Yeah.
It was about the beds
his
he'd slept
childhood
in.
bed,
and he
his
traced
marriage
it all.
bed, his
Yeah.
elderly bed.
Which
yeah.
is okay. There's a nice sort of
No death. No one died in any of the
He was
beds.
still alive when it finished. So yeah.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
I have to admit, sometimes, it can get a bit, if you do too much of this stuff, I, have written quite a bit about murder, and I remember I covered the retrial of a guy, Mark Lundy, convicted of killing his wife and daughter. And that was a 2-week trial in the High Court, and I'd done stories about this for years beforehand. At the end of that, I was so ground down, I needed something like, I went straight up to Tai Happy and stood in a frozen paddock for 3 days watching the New Zealand sheepdog trials because I needed some. Look, there's a lot of drama in sheepdog trials. I really liked the story I wrote after that. I thought it was quite a good one. But you just do need a bit of light and shade. Do you find
Yeah.
that, Nick?
But actually, that's true. I mean, that is a good point, and maybe we miss the drama in the domestic. The drama in those kind of small events, and we probably should do more, stories
Sheepdog trials.
about that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the things that people can really relate to, but there is still a lot of life and a lot of domestic drama in
Kind of like matching
them. But I guess it's just that, those kind of sad stories are more obvious in a way. And so they do tend to be what you gravitate towards. But I do find it difficult with looking for pics for featured, that when I go through as I read stories during the week, I put them into a little archiving system called Pocket. And when I kind of go through them at the end of the week, and I'm thinking, you're always looking for light and shade. I always try not to just have two depressing stories. And it is it's always easier to
Yeah.
find the
I remember
dramatic story.
I remember learning in high school about narrative structure, and conflict is central to it, and you have to have conflict and then resolution, and that's just
Yeah.
a good story. Is
Well,
something
one
that
of my
is
favourite stories that I ever
intentional.
wrote was it was ostensibly about a comedian called Rose Matafeo, who now is quite famous, but back then was just sort of starting out. And I wrote about 3,000 words about her cat. I saw on Twitter that she had sort of had this huge sort of tragedy unfold in her life where her cat ran away, and she was sort of imploring people and like sort of
Conflict.
emoting
Yeah.
out loud online about how sad she was and all the sort of things that were happening. That she sent out flyers and she'd gone to go meet someone who said, and I thought, well, that could be quite a cool little story about this comedian's cat and sort of what's his story. His name was Bert Backercat. So that kind of inherently gave it a bit of interest. So yeah,
There's a lot of cat
but
lovers.
there was,
Yeah.
but in the same way there was drama, but it was light-hearted because
Yeah.
it wasn't it wasn't the end of the world. The people do love their cats, I know.
The cat
But
come back.
The cat came back.
Yay.
Spoiler alert.
Happy ending.
Look, there, in the genre of long-form writing, we often think that it's all about investigative pieces, and that take months and months. But there's another really strong part of feature writing, which is the personal essay, and there's a lot, I don't know if there's a lot more of it happening or not, but Naomi, you've done quite a bit of this, the essay,
Yeah.
the personal essay, which, might include you, family members, whatever, but is that an area of feature writing that you think is growing or is really powerful or is really valid, or,
Yep.
so talk about that.
Yeah, the personal essay. So I guess that's telling a story in a way that telling your own story that you kind of hope other people will draw experiences from and relate to. Maybe bringing in other elements, but I think with the rise of social media, there's been a rise of interest in telling your own story. There's always been personal essays. It's just perhaps they've been branded as such these days. I think it's been a really strong tradition in women's writing as well, and therefore probably not treated as important in the past. I think with social media, Twitter, Facebook, we've seen people have come up out of the darkness and started telling their stories, and other people have been forced to pay attention to them, the media in particular. I remember when I was a journalist first discovering about gender fluidity and changing gender identity, and I was just learning about pronouns. So someone who doesn't identify as a man or a woman will use they or I've forgotten them all. They, them, and my grandma's just gone out the window. But they don't use he, she. They use they and them. And I was just like, I had never heard of this before. And but the social media has allowed people to demand respect in that way. And I think the personal essay has been an easily shared way of exploring that. You can share things. People having these experiences can share experiences that someone has written about that are relevant to them. Other people learn about them. I think it's a really good way to learn about how other people look at the world, how they feel about the world. And
is it scary putting yourself out there, though?
Yeah, both times I've written. Yeah,
you're
all the times.
You're opening the door to your own life.
Yeah, well, again, you're still a character, so you're still picking and choosing what you want people to see. And even though if you might go back later and think, oh God, I really wouldn't have said that, but you're still creating a story, even if it is all true. You're still arranging the sections of the text to create, a flow and a narrative. So in a way, it's actually it's completely true, and it's not true at all, because that's one facet that you've decided to tell. So you almost hide behind that. I mean, I've put some incredibly personal things out there, but I just don't care. Maybe somebody will read it and see themselves in it and feel a sense of identity or connection with that situation, maybe feel better about their own terrible situation. Again, it's usually drama or conflict that the essay comes out of.
You wrote quite powerfully about your mother coming to live with you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about your I guess the consequences of doing that within your own family.
Yeah.
How, did that change anything, or is there understanding that this is how it is? My daughter is a writer, and this is what she's going to do.
I used to write a column with the Nelson Mail for a few years, and the day before deadline, you would often just think, oh my God, and then draw on something that your sister had happened to your sister. And then my sister, I've got two sisters, so it was never clear which one. I didn't name them. But my family, when my sister had a baby, I went over to Australia to hang out with them. And Heather had I just said her name, but anyway, she had a terrible delivery experience. It was, quite full on. And then I went in a bit later, and she was holding the baby, and it was all a beautiful baby scene, gorgeous baby. And she said, "Can you just not write about this, please?" But I did end up writing about it, actually.
Nice sister.
I sent it to her, and she was like, "Ugh, okay." But with my mum, our mum, she doesn't really mind. She's got a really good sense of humour. I was kind of taking the piss out of her, but she just, it was quite full on. The story that I wrote was an essay for a competition. It was never meant to get published, but it ended up being in that book. And they all gave their blessings. I sent it to them and said, "Look, I wrote this thing. I didn't expect it to get out. I took out some chunks that weren't my story to tell. It was other members of the family." And everyone sort of okayed it, and then off it went. So that was very brave of them to allow me to share that. But I guess I'm really lucky that they wanted to support me in that way. But you can really do some damage writing about your family.
because it does really present a lot of interesting ethical issues. Because it's kind of, and I guess it's the same with memoir, but inevitably you think you're telling your story, but your story inevitably involves other people's stories.
And it's only one truth, it's not the other.
And there was a really interesting case that went to the Press Council earlier this year, where someone wrote about their grandmother and drew on letters with between sort of love letters between the grandparents, and so her grandmother was still alive but had dementia, so her mother had power of attorney, so she'd got permission from the mother who had power of attorney and another sister, but then another sister complained and said, she would never have wanted this information out there, and so it just became this really kind of fraught thing, which, so it's...
you have to put your family first, or you just, you're going to end up with nothing, no matter how good the story is.
Hey, we often think of feature writing in the traditional terms of long stories in a newspaper or in a magazine, but increasingly there are other ways to tell stories. Charles, you mentioned earlier about the lovely formatting now online of long stories with beautiful photos embedded and video, etc., etc. another way, obviously, that's becoming popular is the podcast, which in a way is not a new thing. It's like an old radio serial that you used to hear, so it's not really anything new, but it's having a resurgence. And it's in the news at the moment. There's obviously, if you've seen it on Stuff, a series called Black Hands, which is done by the Christchurch journalist Martin van Beynen, works for the press, about the David Bain murders, and that's a 10-part audio series about those. So Charles, do you just want to talk about, and you're very involved in this kind of stuff, in this new way of storytelling. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, but also, if you can, about stuff that you might be doing?
I guess it's, as technologies kind of increase, it's just become more and more apparent that you have to take advantage of any avenue and tool you have to be able to tell a great story. And once upon a time that was just in a book and it was text, but there's so many other things that can do that now, and it doesn't even have to involve words necessarily. And so, I mean, when I first started out, that was pretty much it. It was just text with an occasional photo sort of put through it. And then in America, there was quite a big move to replicate the idea of a magazine in an online format. Like how can you engage a reader from design and incorporate design into the storytelling? So it's no longer just about the words you're reading; it's about the experience. And so I tried to kind of replicate a lot of that into what I was doing at Fairfax, which was basically creating a bit of an immersive experience that you'd go onto a website, and rather than just seeing text pop up, you'd see a whole thing come at you. So I wrote a story which was the first kind of its kind in New Zealand, which was about a lost plane that crashed supposedly in Awarua in Golden Bay, and it was the first attempt at a trans-Tasman flight in 1927, and it was just basically telling the story about whether or not it exists out there in the bush. But rather than just writing a straight story, I went back and got all the old newspaper articles from the time, and they were available in their sort of raw format that you could kind of allow the viewer to almost look at your primary sources themselves, along with sort of video of the search and rescue team out in the bush trying to find this thing. So it becomes more than just one avenue to tell a story, which can be, distracting as well. So it's kind of this balance of how do you create a sort of a tightrope of where everything is in service of the story, where it's not just a lot of things being thrown at you. When it comes to podcasts, I've just started reading this, listening to Martin's series, and it's, it does come down to great writing. And I made the comment to Mike last night. I've known Martin for quite a few years and worked with him in Christchurch, and Mike certainly has in his. But I think this is probably the best writing that I've ever seen him do, even though I'm listening to it. He's totally immersed in his subject, and he covered the Bain retrial in 2009, and was working on a book for a long time before that kind of fell over. So that became the basis for this podcast, that he's sort of just had got all this material that he's now just kind of concentrating into this one product, and you just don't want to know the amount of time that he's put into it. But it's quite an incredible thing, and I recommend you checking it out if you just search it, Black Hands or Bain podcast probably.
And interestingly, he took the book text and had to sort of turn it around and completely redo it to get the podcast. So it's such a
but
different
it's still writing.
discipline. Yeah,
ultimately, it comes down to really good writing and really good storytelling, and that's been downloaded 550,000 times. I think was the last number I saw. That kind of is really good. It shows to me that there's still an audience out there for people that want to hear or read great stories. And so it does come down to storytelling. Multimedia stuff, Charles, again, are we increasingly going to see stories told in different ways using the technology that's available?
I think so. I think like we're only kind of just touching on what can be done. I'm sort of, funnily enough, moving away from writing of late and actually trying to figure out a bit more of this technology. So I'm working on a documentary at the moment on the housing crisis, for lack of a better term, around the country. And there's no writing per se, but it's all using sort of 360-degree video to allow the viewer to kind of be situated in a place and then can scroll around and see where you are, interactive data graphics that are kind of, so rather than looking at a graph, you can actually manipulate things on a table just to show how something might affect you personally. So it sounds like it's a different area to feature writing or to storytelling, but it's actually it's just putting the power more in the hands of the reader or the viewer. So rather than me telling you something or you sitting in front of a television and watching a normal documentary, it's more allowing you to control how you want to view the material, which is kind of it's switching that relationship up, which is quite fun and a bit daunting because it's so new. But the technologies are there to allow people to explore that kind of idea, which is quite interesting.
And in 5 to 10 years, it's going to be VR, so we're going to be walking. We'll be out
Not
there.
even that.
New Zealand's a little bit far behind, but
this is virtual reality where
yeah.
you use the same idea, but you can, rather than come to Spy Valley and listen to a book festival, you could be at home with some goggles on, looking around and seeing Mike on the.
But you're not going to get a glass of bubbly, are you?
It depends how well stocked your fridge is, I guess.
Yeah. But you could walk through the Bain home with this and follow, pick things up, look at it. You can hear audio, you can hear the screams. I don't know, but it's not far off. Yeah.
Hey, look, we're running towards the end of the session, but there is a few moments for questions. If people have got questions, there's 3 really great journalists here who use them if you can. Ask them questions. Rhonda.
These stories.
Where do you get most of your ideas from? People send you things and say, hey, how about you look into this? Or is it from looking online, looking at newspapers, listening to
Nikki, you go. 'Cause we've talked about this.
Yeah, the funny thing is, we're driving here and talking about questions, and I said, well, look, the most common thing that I get asked when I say I'm a journalist is, where do you get your ideas? Because people are fascinated, and I don't know. I sort of tend to break them down into 3 sort of loose groups. One is the story behind the story. So often there'll be something in the news, an event, something that's happened. But you're just getting that very superficial veneer, and you think, well, what really went on there, or what actually was behind, the Beck 11 kind of example, a little snippet of information, and that just makes you think, I wonder what that person's story was, or what happened behind that. The second one is kind of issue stories, so. And again, they'll often be prompted by maybe a series of news stories or just things that are in the news, and you start to think, so a classic one is kind of water. So there's just been an accumulation of, well, this place, this beautiful running stream that we used to swim in has become this dried up creek or swamp or whatever, and you start to think, well, what's the bigger issue there? What do we actually have to look at? Why this is happening and what we need to do about it. And the other one is just personal things that are happening in your life, and because there's a good chance that if something is an issue or of importance to you, that it's also something that other people are talking about or interested in. One that a couple of stories that I've done earlier this year have been on one level just really mundane. One was talking about relationship property laws, what happens when people break up, and all the kind of legal fishhooks and things that go on there. And another one was about wills, about adult children challenging wills. So just really everyday things, but because they're really everyday things, they affect everybody.
People don't talk about them because they're so sort of...
They get shared a lot too. Those
exactly, because they're kind of actually relevant to people's lives.
But certainly people do give me tips and emails, random little emails, and go, do you know about my brother who... I did it when I was in Christchurch, who was one of the last people living in the red zone. He was a guy who was in his 70s caring for his mentally handicapped son, and it was just... he just, do you know about this guy? And it's like, I'll just drive down there, and there he was, just hanging out, and it's like this kind of little oasis amongst the desolation of the red zone, and he's just doesn't care, So that kind of stuff certainly does happen. But I mean, the famous story behind In Cold Blood, Truman
exactly.
Capote, was a New York Times brief, this family that was murdered in sort of rural America, and it was turned into, one of those, but that's sort of the starting point for most feature writers in the world. If you haven't read it, In Cold Blood, yes, but the sort of true crime non-fiction novel.
Naomi, do you have
Yeah.
a muse that descends on you at 2 a.m. and says, "This would be a
Yeah,
wonderful
I have
story,
a really long
Naomi"?
list on my phone of ideas. I will never get around to them, but one.
I've stolen a few of those.
Yeah. One happened the other night. I was out for dinner with my friend, and she's an audiologist at Nelson Hospital, and she was telling me about some unbelievable stats about the number of prisoners who have hearing difficulties, and it was 90% or something unbelievable. And it's like, oh my God, like what have these people gone through in their lives to, through schooling, through employment, and then ended up where they are because they can't hear and possibly can't read or write, have much literacy. So I'm going to go and spend a day with her in her audiology department with kids getting, grommets and cochlear implants and pitch that to somebody. Yeah. So there you go. Look out for it.
Yeah.
What about you, Mike?
Oh, I get, tips from a lot of people, and 99% of them are just nutters. And so when you think, oh, you must be really in the know, you honestly, there's a lot of sifting that goes through. People do tell you that this make a great story, but after a while you learn what is going to interest you. It's got to interest you. Going back to what we talked about much earlier, it's got to interest you. You've got to be right into it and passionate about it, and B, it's got to be something new that people haven't done before. But it's got to be true, and some of the stories that get pitched to you just don't work out, and you can waste a lot of time, actually, and you do waste a lot of time looking at stories, seeing whether they stack up, and then they just don't pan out. So that's frustrating, but that's just part of the game, yeah. Any other questions that people...
Sorry, I was just wondering if I asked yourself and the panel, passion about an idea or a concept is obviously shows through it as important. I'd just like to ask you if you've ever been that passionate about it, doing a story, and then as you've investigated the story and investigated things, all of a sudden it's gone to a tangent and not in the direction that you might have expected it to, and it's changed your complete perception about your passion for that story, and you think, oh, it wasn't actually as I had passionately believed it was going to be.
That's happened to you,
Yep.
Mike, hasn't
Sorry?
it? Hasn't it happened to you?
Oh,
It's
it happens,
funny. It was fun.
what were you thinking about?
I can't. There's so many different amazing ones you've done, but possibly I can't remember. You tell it.
Well, no, I mean, there are stories where you go into them thinking you know where they're going to go, and they don't end up there. You know, and you do end up writing a story which is completely different to what you imagined you would. And sometimes the people who you're writing about, they don't like that in the end. But you've got to be honest and you've got to be true. Sometimes, yep, your energy does run out a little bit midstream, but usually I'll see a story through. Sometimes I have spent weeks and months looking at, reading through files and case notes and thinking, this is going to be a great story, this is going to be a great story. I remember, one case which I thought was really going to stack up, and like I say, I had boxes of files which I read through. But in the end, I thought, nah, you did it. This was a guy who'd been convicted of something, and I just couldn't see any other way of telling that story, and I certainly wasn't going to pretend that this guy was innocent just to make a good yarn. So, yeah, a lot of wasted time, but those things happen. Guys, any other, thoughts on that?
Yeah. You have to be careful not to, indulge in confirmation bias where you see what's already, you see what you think is there, or what you already think is there. Journalists have opinions and approaches to things, and you constantly have to be stepping back and saying, am I actually seeing what is there, or what I think is there, or what I hope is there as well. So you have to be really aware of your own influences on the story, and that's something that's really important to keep an eye on.
If I'm doing an issue story, my starting point will normally be, well, this is an interesting issue, I'm going to investigate it, rather than, I think every journalist's worst nightmare or most terrified moment is when an editor asks you to do a story which, starts with a foregone conclusion. It's kind of like, well, that's not journalism. Fine, I can look at the issue, but the story should come out of that investigative process, not the starting point is not the conclusion.
And the reader shouldn't be able to tell what side you're on.
Yeah.
Either, you know.
Mm. Not quite like that, but in terms of a story shifting and potentially making it better, I was in Thailand a couple of years ago doing the story was going to be about this New Zealand Dunedin-based Muay Thai kickboxer who had trained in Thailand for many years and had lived there and then had gone away, and he was coming back for his sort of final hurrah. So it was, the story in my mind was, this kind of journeyman kickboxer who was going back to Thailand for his final kind of bout before he kind of retires. And that was, we're going to follow him through the process and see his final fight. And then it just turned out that our timing was completely off and he wasn't going to be fighting, but we were already in Thailand. So what are we going to do? We've got 3 days of this guy, and we haven't got the dramatic fight at the end of the, we haven't got the Rocky standing over the guy. That was what was in my mind. But what it turned out was that the guy was like, well, okay, I'm not fighting, but come and look at my gym, just see where I train. And it turns out the guy who runs the gym is a bank manager. But Muay Thai is so part of Thai culture, and the way same with the rugby is here, but it's sort of like seen as an out for so many of like children in poverty and that kind of thing. So this guy houses his gym at his home, and he has kids who come and basically board with him and train in the gym and live in the gym and do their schoolwork in the gym. So it became pretty apparent that actually this old white dude from New Zealand training in Thailand is not very interesting at all compared to watching these kids and telling their story. That they're in mosquito nets in front of a television, surrounded by punching bags, doing their homework on the boxing room gym, basically as a means to get out of sort of extreme poverty that they found themselves in. So that can happen, which is very pleasing. The opposite can also happen, which is you talked about, which you've got this great idea and then nothing happens. And it's like, okay, now,
Look, we have run over time. There will be time for questions if people have got more questions. Sorry to cut that short, but Charles and Naomi and Nikki will be here, and I think Naomi's got some books that she'll be able to sign at the back. Paper Plus is here, fantastic. Thank you so much for doing that, guys. I just want to kind of finish on two things. Don't click on clickbait, because the more you click on that crap, the less chance there is for really good storytelling to rise above and be seen. The more you click on clickbait, the more you're going to get of it. And if you want to read really good stories, often they're hard to find. And so part of what we've given you today, that sheet to take away, there's some really great stories there, but there's also a thing called Featured. Now, Featured was set up by Naomi about 3 years ago, which is essentially a library of great New Zealand features, and Nikki and I now do deal with that. And every Monday we send you out an email which has 2 brilliant New Zealand features and then 4 international features. We know you're not going to read them all. We know that no one's got time. Everyone's, time poor, etc. But at least we've gone through and done the hard work and and found these good stories, put them in front of you. And if you do get time, can drag yourself away from clicking on crap on stuff and the Herald, then there are these really great stories
it's not all
to
crap
read.
On stuff.
No, or the Herald. No,
Daily Mail.
No,
links,
exactly.
Yeah.
So there are these really good stories. Now, so the details are there on that sheet about Featured. Just go on there and sign up to it, and we'll send you an email each week.
And we
It's
also
free.
do book giveaways as well, so there's
Yes.
free books flying around the country.
And there's, on the actual website itself, there's all the stories that we've put up in the past. So there's just
There's about 300 now. isn't it?
Yeah, oodles of great reading there. So look, if you could, that's one way of helping support decent journalism in New Zealand, and hopefully it'll be able to carry on and keep people like Nikki, Naomi, Charles and me from having to take a job in a bank. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out today. All right, and thanks again to you guys and to Spy Valley. And like I say, there's chance to have a chat out the back. Thanks.